Since the war, the Treasury Department has continued selling E-bonds. A lot of us have continued buying them.
For decades, the circumstances surrounding the death of Jeff Chandler, the charismatic and widely admired film star of the 1950s, have been cloaked in a fog of mystery, speculation, and conflicting reports. His sudden demise at the age of 42 sent shockwaves through Hollywood and left fans grasping for answers that never seemed to arrive. Though it was officially reported that he died due to complications following back surgery, many of the details didn't sit right with those closest to him or with anyone who examined the case with even a hint of scrutiny. Now, after years of silence, buried documents, hushed whispers, and dogged investigation, the mystery has finally been cracked open. And the truth is far more unsettling than anyone could have anticipated. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Chandler was more than just a leading man. Towering at over 6 feet tall with piercing features and a voice that could command both tenderness and authority, he had rapidly ascended the ranks of Hollywood royalty. Known for his roles in films like Broken Arrow and Merrill's Marauders, Chandler was beloved not only for his screen presence, but also for his reputed professionalism and generosity off-set. It was precisely this wholesome public image that made the circumstances of his death so baffling. Here was a man in seemingly excellent health, in the prime of his life, undergoing what should have been a routine procedure, and yet, he never came out of that hospital alive. For years, the official line was simple. Chandler underwent surgery for a slipped disc following a filming injury, developed complications, and died of blood poisoning. It was accepted, though not without lingering unease. But behind closed doors, contradictions abounded. Medical records were incomplete. Witnesses who worked at the hospital reported unusual behavior by the staff. Rumors swirled that Chandler had made powerful enemies, had become involved in conflicts outside the glamorous confines of the studio world, or had stumbled into something darker. But none of these whispers ever cohered into evidence strong enough to break through the wall of institutional silence that surrounded his death. Until now. The case had long gone cold. What finally triggered its reopening wasn't a confession or a new witness, but a box. One that had been misfiled in a private collection belonging to a long-retired nurse who had worked at the hospital where Chandler died. Her granddaughter, sorting through belongings, found a stash of meticulously kept journals, newspaper clippings, and most damningly, a set of photographs and internal memos stamped confidential. The granddaughter, curious but cautious, passed them to a local historian, who quickly realized their implications and turned them over to a pair of independent researchers. What they uncovered reframed the entire narrative. Among the materials was evidence that Chandler's surgery had not been conducted under proper conditions. The operating room had been understaffed. The equipment used was outdated. The attending physician, whose name had been lightly touched upon in past reports, had been under investigation at the time for malpractice, a fact completely omitted from the public record. But what made it all truly explosive wasn't just the incompetence, it was the deliberate concealment. The files indicated that the hospital board had conspired with studio executives to suppress the truth, fearing a scandal that could damage not only the medical institution's reputation, but also the box office fortunes of Chandler's ongoing projects. Studio involvement wasn't just incidental, it was active. Multiple memos detailed conversations between the studio's legal department and hospital administrators. One particularly damning document outlined a strategy to shift the blame onto Chandler himself, painting a picture of a man whose body was overworked and worn down from pushing himself too far. The real cause of death, it seemed, had more to do with internal hemorrhaging caused by a surgical error, a cut artery that had gone unnoticed for hours. By the time the mistake was caught, it was far too late. What elevates this revelation from tragic to chilling, however, is the motivation behind the cover-up. It wasn't simply a matter of preserving reputations, it was about money. Chandler had just signed a major multi-film contract worth millions. He was tied to several productions that were already in progress, and a scandal involving medical malpractice could have caused investors to pull out and box office returns to tank. The studio, in desperation, leaned on the hospital to withhold details. In return, the hospital was allegedly promised generous philanthropic donations and a sweeping rebranding campaign funded by the studio's publicity machine. This alliance between medicine and media formed a fortress of secrecy that no journalist could breach at the time. Several tried. A handful of reports from the early 1960s hinted at inconsistencies, only to be swiftly discredited. One reporter lost his job shortly after publishing an article that questioned the surgical narrative. He later admitted to friends that he had been visited by studio representatives who offered him a choice: retract the piece or face legal ruin. Fearing for his family's livelihood, he complied. That pattern repeated itself several times over the following years, building a culture of enforced silence. Unpacking the implications of this now revealed conspiracy forces a re-evaluation not just of Chandler's death, but of the systems that allowed such a cover-up to occur. Hollywood in the 1950s was an empire built on image. Stars were not simply entertainers, they were products, carefully packaged and fiercely protected. Studios held immense power, capable of making or breaking lives with a phone call. That such influence could reach into the corridors of a hospital and dictate what would and wouldn't be said on a death certificate paints a grim picture of the era's moral landscape. The discovery also forces a more personal reflection on the value of truth and the ease with which it can be buried under layers of convenience and fear. Chandler's family, kept in the dark, mourned under false pretenses. His colleagues and fans denied the real story, moved on believing in a fiction. The public, manipulated by headlines and press releases, swallowed a narrative carefully constructed to hide the chaos behind the curtain. And all the while, those responsible walked away unscathed, their complicity dissolved in time. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the entire affair is the knowledge that Chandler died unaware of the machinery grinding behind him. He went into surgery trusting the professionals, likely expecting to be back on his feet within weeks. There's no record of panic, no signs that he foresaw the end. That lack of forewarning makes his fate all the more cruel, especially when juxtaposed with the level of intention and coordination that followed his death. While he lay dying, others were already spinning the tale that would frame his exit, a tale that held firm for over 6 decades. This unmasking also raises questions about how many other such stories have remained hidden. If one star's death could be so expertly manipulated, who else has suffered similar fates without ever sparking suspicion? The Chandler case may be the most visible, the most documented, but it may not be unique. The revelations may open the floodgates for new investigations as historians and journalists begin to dig with fresh eyes and bolder intent. The ripple effects of this breakthrough may stretch far beyond a single man's story. Despite the horror of the truth, there is a certain vindication in its emergence. Chandler's legacy now becomes one not of weakness or medical misfortune, but of victimhood in a larger system of greed and manipulation. His name, long associated with stoicism and strength, takes on new resonance as a reminder of how even the most seemingly invincible among us can be undone by the quiet machinery of institutional failure. And in uncovering that machinery, we are forced to confront the deeper ethical void at the heart of systems that prioritize profit over people. There is also a potent irony in how the revelation came to light, not through a court ruling or a bombshell expose, but through a forgotten box tucked away in an attic. In the end, it wasn't grandstanding that shattered the lie, but quiet persistence. A granddaughter sorting through memories. A historian who recognized the weight of a file. Independent researchers willing to sift through pages that others had long since dismissed. Their work doesn't just bring closure to a long-standing mystery, it reaffirms the power of truth to pierce even the most fortified silence. For many, this will change how Chandler is remembered. No longer just the noble warrior of the silver screen, he becomes a symbol of both how easily narratives can be twisted and how essential it is to keep questioning them. His death, stripped now of its fictionalized shell, becomes something rawer, harder, and ultimately more human. There is no neat bow to tie around it. It is not a story of resolution, but of revelation, a painful unveiling of what lies beneath the surface of polished legends. The public reaction to the findings is likely to be complex. There will be outrage, sorrow, disbelief. There may even be efforts to discredit the evidence, to question the motives behind its publication. But those efforts will find themselves standing against a tide that has already begun to turn. The myth has cracked, the image has shattered, And what stands in its place is not just a man's fate, but a mirror held up to an entire era. Though the answers have come late, decades too late for justice in the traditional sense, they come with the weight of truth, undeniable and sobering. And with that truth, Chandler, though long gone, finally has his voice returned. Not the carefully scripted one from press releases and studio statements, but the real one. The one silenced in an operating room by error and buried by men in suits. That voice, now echoing across time, speaks not just of what happened to him, but of how such things happen, and how they can be stopped, if only we're willing to look closely and refuse to look away. The unraveling of Jeff Chandler's death has not only rewritten a personal narrative, but has also spotlighted the broader systemic dynamics that allowed it to remain obscured for so long. Now that the truth has come to light, the question becomes, what exactly made it possible for an industry, a hospital, and the individuals behind both to operate in lockstep silence for decades? The answer lies in the intricate structure of power and influence woven through 1950s Hollywood, a structure far more fortified than most imagine. Operating not merely through glamour and star power, but through legal intimidation, institutional alliances, and an almost religious devotion to secrecy. Studios of that era didn't just produce movies, they curated reality. They controlled the press through financial partnerships, selectively leaked stories through loyal gossip columnists, and maintained public images with the precision of military propaganda. A scandal involving one of their biggest stars wasn't merely a PR issue, it was a financial threat. Film budgets often depended on bank loans backed by insurance tied to the star's continued viability. Any suggestion that Chandler's health had been compromised by error or negligence could have shattered financial frameworks already in motion. So when his life ended prematurely, the response wasn't grief, it was crisis management. What sets this apart from typical corporate cover-ups is the deeply personal nature of the deception. Chandler wasn't an expendable extra. He was a top-billed lead, an emblem of masculinity and American grit. But when his death risked becoming an inconvenient liability, even his star power wasn't enough to protect him. He became, paradoxically, both the face of the studio and a casualty of its ruthless calculus. He died not just from medical error, but from the decision that it was better, safer, cleaner, more lucrative, to let the lie live than to let the truth breathe. The collusion between the hospital and the studio also reflects a larger truth about institutional entanglement. In theory, hospitals are centers of healing, guided by medical ethics and independent governance. But as the Chandler documents have now shown, those principles can be compromised when reputational damage looms large enough. The evidence revealed not just passive complicity, but active participation. Falsified records, adjusted statements, and at least one nurse who was quietly transferred after raising concerns about the operating room protocols that day. It points to a hospital administration that had its own motivations for burying the truth, an already precarious financial position, a history of minor infractions, threatening accreditation, and a heavy reliance on donations, some of which were now being dangled as incentives to comply. There is no documentation of Chandler being informed of any risks beyond the standard disclaimers. That is key. The files suggest that not only was he kept in the dark, but his family was deliberately misled in the aftermath. A flurry of internal correspondence suggests a concerted effort to present a unified front to his relatives, discouraging questions and nudging them toward a swift acceptance of the official story. There were even notes about arranging private grief counseling, less out of compassion and more to redirect their focus inward rather than outward toward blame. The calculated nature of such actions reveals a playbook for containment, one that prioritized closure over clarity. This discovery now stands as a benchmark moment in rethinking how historical narratives are constructed. For a long time, the story of Jeff Chandler's death served as a cautionary tale about the risks of physical exertion and bad luck in surgery. It was quoted in biographies, referenced in retrospectives, and etched into Hollywood lore with a kind of melancholic finality. But that narrative was not organic, it was engineered. And because it was repeated often enough, and by seemingly authoritative sources, it became truth by repetition. This reveals something critical. Once a lie enters the public record with sufficient conviction, it gains momentum that can carry it unquestioned for generations. What makes the Chandler mystery especially compelling is that it demonstrates how the erasure of truth doesn't always require massive conspiracies. Just a handful of well-placed individuals, a few deliberate omissions, and a population trained to trust what they're told. Once the machinery of silence is in motion, it only requires maintenance, not expansion. A corrected article here, a brief statement there, and the momentum of the official narrative carries on like a train with no brakes. In Chandler's case, that train has now finally derailed, but the track it laid still runs through much of our collective memory. The impact on those who worked with Chandler should also be considered. Many of his co-stars and directors were left grappling with emotional confusion after his passing. While some quietly voiced doubts about the timeline or medical explanation, their concerns were typically drowned out by the weight of officialdom. In hindsight, it becomes painfully clear that they too were victims of the cover-up, manipulated into grieving under false pretenses. Some even questioned themselves, wondering whether they had missed signs, failed to intervene, or contributed unknowingly to the exhaustion and pressure that supposedly caused his health to deteriorate. The truth, now exposed, may bring relief to some and bitter anger to others. Another element buried for years is Chandler's increasing discomfort with the industry in the years before his death. Private letters and journal fragments, now authenticated, show a man growing more disillusioned with the roles he was being offered, the way the studio treated its stars, and the constant pressure to maintain an image that no longer felt authentic. Though he never publicly criticized the system, those closest to him saw a shift, a quiet tension, a sense of fatigue that went beyond physical. It is tempting to see this disillusionment as foreshadowing, though at the time it was simply perceived as the normal wear of fame. Knowing now that he died not because of fate, but because of negligence hidden behind a corporate mask adds tragic weight to those final months. There's also a cultural dimension that can't be ignored. Chandler was Jewish in a time when overt displays of Jewish identity were often discouraged or softened in Hollywood's public presentation. While not overtly relevant to the cause of his death, the identity politics of the era may have made it easier for the studio to prioritize image over truth. Many Jewish actors were subjected to rebranding, changing names, reshaping biographies to fit a more universal ideal. Chandler, born Ira Grossel, had already undergone such a transformation. That willingness to reshape a man's identity for marketability set a precedent for how far the studio would go when an inconvenient reality threatened to interfere with public perception. As the fallout from this revelation begins to reverberate, a significant question arises: what does accountability look like when the perpetrators are either long gone or their institutions have changed hands multiple times? The executives involved in the cover-up are likely deceased, and the hospital has undergone so many transitions that its current administration may bear no resemblance to the one complicit in the past. Still, history demands reckoning, even if justice in the traditional sense remains out of reach. There are calls already emerging for a formal acknowledgement, perhaps a memorial, an apology from successor institutions, or at the very least, the correction of official records. Whether those steps materialize remains uncertain. The Chandler case also holds implications for future generations of historians and biographers. It serves as a caution against taking archival documents at face value. Just because a file is labeled final report doesn't mean it's the full story. Just because a press release quotes a doctor doesn't mean the doctor spoke freely. Researchers will now look more skeptically at other celebrity deaths that have been hastily explained and never revisited. The veneer of certainty that coats many historical accounts has been pierced. Going forward, there may be a more rigorous push to validate truths that have sat unquestioned for decades. Media institutions, too, face their own form of reckoning. The Chandler story underscores the way news can be shaped by access and influence. Several of the leading publications at the time published identical language in their obituaries and reports, much of which was later traced back to a single studio-crafted press release. That level of conformity is not coincidental. It's a signal of narrative control. The media was not simply duped. In many cases, it was complicit, accepting the convenience of prepackaged information over the hard, messy labor of investigation. That dynamic, while perhaps less blatant today, still exists in subtler forms, making this rediscovery a wake-up call for journalists as well. In the shadow of this revelation, the final image of Jeff Chandler becomes both more human and more heroic. Not in the conventional sense of overcoming a visible enemy or completing a triumphant arc, but in the deeper sense of enduring within a system built to control him. His death, long sanitized and stripped of agency, now regains its rightful gravity. The lie has been unlearned, the silence has been broken, and the man, once reduced to a cautionary tale, now stands as a symbol of truth delayed but not denied. Even if no one is punished, even if no restitution is made, the act of telling the story, completely honestly, without editorial flinching, is itself a kind of justice. It forces a confrontation with the mechanisms that shape history and calls attention to the cost of forgetting. Chandler deserved better in life, but in death, with the mystery finally solved, he may finally receive something that for decades was withheld, the dignity of being known, not as a victim of misfortune, but as a man who was failed by the very system sworn to protect him. And that knowledge, now irreversible, becomes its own form of resolution. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Jeff Chandler's mystery? What do you think happened? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.